The term Black September refers to the Jordanian Civil War that began in September 1970 and ended in July of 1971. The conflict was fought between the Palestine Liberation Organization under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, and the Jordanian armed forces under the leadership of King Hussein. At its core, the civil war sought to determine if Jordan would be ruled by the Palestine Liberation Organization or the Hashemite monarchy. The war resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, the vast majority Palestinian. Armed conflict ended with the expulsion of the PLO leadership and thousands of Palestinian fighters to Lebanon. Background: Palestinians in Jordan. The United Nations partition plan for Palestine in late 1947 led to civil war, the end of mandatory Palestine, and the Israeli Declaration of Independence on 14 May 1948. With nationhood, the ongoing civil war was transformed into a state conflict between Israel and the Arab states. Egypt, Jordan and Syria, together with expeditionary forces from Iraq, invaded Israel. They took control of the Arab areas, and immediately attacked Israeli forces and several Jewish settlements. The fighting was halted with the UN-mediated 1949 armistice agreements, but the remaining areas of Palestine came under the control of Egypt and Transjordan. In 1949, Transjordan officially changed its name to Jordan. In 1950, it annexed the West Bank of the Jordan River, and brought Palestinian representation into the government. In Egyptian-dominated Gaza Strip, there was an attempt to establish the All-Palestine government in September 1948. Partially recognized by the Arab League, but its authority was limited, and it was effectively abolished by Nasser in 1959. Only one-third of the combined population of the West Bank and Jordan consisted of Jordanians, which meant that the Jordanians had become a ruling minority over a Palestinian majority. However, Jordan had provided Palestinians with seats mounting to half the parliament and several governmental positions. Moshe Shemesh claims that this proved to be a mercurial element in internal Jordanian politics, and played a critical role in the political opposition. The West Bank had become the center of the national and territorial aspects of the Palestinian problem, which was the key issue of Jordan's domestic and foreign policy. According to King Hussein, the Palestinian problem spelled life or death for Jordan, and would remain the country's overriding national security issue. King Hussein feared an independent West Bank under PLO administration would threaten the autonomy of his Hashemite kingdom. The Palestinian factions were supported variously by many Arab governments, most notably Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who gave political support. The Palestinian nationalist organization Fatah started organizing attacks against Israel in January 1965, and Israel was subject to repeated cross-border attacks by Palestinian Fedayeen. These often drew reprisals. The Samu incident was one such reprisal. Jordan had long maintained secret contacts with Israel concerning peace and security along their border. However, due to internal splits within the Jordanian government and population, many of King Hussein's orders to stop these raids were not obeyed, and some Jordanian commanders along the Israeli-Jordanian border were lending passive assistance to the Palestinian raids. In June 1967, Israel captured the West Bank from Jordan during the Six-Day War. Battle of Karameh on 21 March 1968, Israel Defense Forces units entered Jordan and destroyed a PLO base camp in the village of Karameh. The PLO suffered some 200 killed and another 150 taken prisoner. 40 Jordanian soldiers were also killed. Israeli casualties stood at 28 to 33 killed and 69 to 161 wounded. The Karameh operation highlighted the vulnerability of bases close to the Jordan River, so the PLO moved their bases farther into the mountains, which placed additional strains on their operations. Further Israeli attacks targeted Palestinian militants residing among the Jordanian civilian population. giving rise to friction between Jordanians and guerrillas. 7-point agreement in Palestinian enclaves and refugee camps in Jordan. The Jordanian police and army were losing their authority. Uniformed PLO militants openly carried weapons, set up checkpoints, and attempted to extort taxes. During the November 1968 negotiations, a 7-point agreement was reached between King Hussein and Palestinian organizations. Members of these organizations were forbidden from walking around cities armed and in uniform. They were forbidden to stop and search civilian vehicles. They were forbidden from competing with the Jordanian army for recruits. They were required to carry Jordanian identity papers. Their vehicles were required to bear Jordanian license plates. Crimes committed by members of the Palestinian organizations would be investigated by the Jordanian authorities. The PLO did not live up to the agreement, and instead came to be seen more and more as a state within a state in Jordan. Discipline in the Palestinian militias was often poor, and there was no central power to control the different groups. Many of them were recently formed, and new groups sprang up spontaneously after the Karmeh battle, or were set up by foreign governments such as Syria and Iraq. This created a bewildering scene of groups rapidly spawning, merging, and splintering, often trying to outdo each other in radicalism to attract recruits. Some left-wing Palestinian movements, such as the PFLP and the DFLP, began to openly question the legitimacy of the Jordanian monarchy and call for its overthrow, while at the same time stirring up conservative and religious feelings with provocative anti-religious statements and actions. In other cases, illustrating the lack of discipline on the fringes of the movement, Fedayeen activity became a cover for gangsterism, with theft of vehicles or extortion of local merchants claimed as confiscation for the war effort, or donations to the cause. The largest Palestinian faction, Arafat Fatah, preached non-involvement in Jordanian affairs, but not all members lived up to this slogan. Fatah also protected smaller movements from being singled out for retaliation by the government by threatening to stand with them in any armed clashes. Palestinians claimed there were numerous agents provocateurs from Jordanian or other security services present among the Fedayeen, deliberately trying to upset political relations and provoke justification for a crackdown. Between mid-1968 and the end of 1969, no fewer than 500 violent clashes occurred between the Palestinian guerrillas and Jordanian security forces. There were frequent kidnappings and acts of violence against civilians. Chief of the Jordanian royal court Zayed al-Rifai claimed that in one extreme instance, the Fedayeen killed a soldier, beheaded him, and played football with his head in the area where he used to live. Militarily, the PLO continued attacking Israel from Jordanian territory with little regard for Jordanian authority or security. Heavy Israeli reprisals resulted in both Palestinian and Jordanian casualties, and the threat of larger-scale Israeli invasion loomed large. 10-point edict in February 1970, King Hussein visited Egyptian President Nasser and American President Nixon. Upon his return, he published a 10-point edict restricting activities of the Palestinian organizations. On the 11th of February, fighting broke out between Jordanian security forces and Palestinian groups in the streets of Amman, resulting in about 300 deaths. Hoping to prevent this violence spinning out of control, Hussein announced that "we are all Fedayeen," and fired the interior minister, who was hostile toward the Palestinians. Armed Palestinians set up a parallel system of visa controls, customs checks, and checkpoints in Jordanian cities, adding more tensions to an already polarized Jordanian society and army. Between February and June 1970, about 1,000 lives were lost in Jordan due to the conflict. In July, Egypt and Jordan accepted the US-backed Rogers Plan, which called for a ceasefire in the war of attrition between Egypt and Israel, and for Israel's negotiated withdrawal from territories occupied in 1967. In accordance with United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, it called for the West Bank to come under King Hussein's authority, and that was unacceptable to the more radical organizations. The PLO, George Habash's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and NAIF Hawatma's Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine opposed the plan, and heavily criticized Nasser for agreeing to it. There were claims the plan had been a trap conceived to destroy the PLO's relations with Nasser. It was never implemented. With Nasser alienated, King Hussein began his military campaign against the PLO, while more radical Palestinian organizations became determined to undermine Hussein's pro-Western regime.